Welcome to the third lecture in this Vietnam War series. I'm your teacher today, Mr. Jose. So we left off with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and there's this alleged attack over there in the Gulf of Tonkin, and suddenly now Johnson is asking Congress for this greater authority, and he becomes, after the Gulf of Tonkin, the big boss shot caller. Don't need Congress, blank check. And basically, he becomes the shot caller of the Vietnam conflict because there's this concept of the blank check. And what it basically implies is that he is able to escalate the U.S. involvement in Vietnam without involving Congress, without getting a declaration of war. His authority has now elevated itself to all new levels. And one of the impacts of the Gulf of Tonkin, because later on people are going to look back at this and go, did it even happen? It kind of becomes the symbol for the government misleading the American public, or in some people's minds, lying to the American public. Now, what does happen, though, without any doubt, is American troops start hitting the ground in Vietnam in greater numbers. By 1965, the end of 1965, you have nearly 200,000 troops. By the end of 1968, you have over 500,000 troops. And if you look at this, you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, America, the biggest, the most powerful military, is going to be getting some W's, some wins in Vietnam. And the reality is, it doesn't translate into victory. In fact, one of the problems of Vietnam, as it begins to be escalated by Lyndon Johnson, is you have the troops on the ground in South Vietnam, and this policy of gradual escalation is coupled with, in 1965, he begins a policy or a program called Operation Rolling Thunder. We're dropping bombs on Vietnam. In fact, Operation Rolling Thunder, non-stop bombing for 3 years of North Vietnam. And the goal is really simple. If we bomb North Vietnam, that will interfere with the supplies coming in from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. We'll bomb, we'll destroy their ability to supply the Viet Cong over in South Vietnam. Maybe it will pressure North Vietnam into negotiating some sort of settlement, and the results is basically we drop more bombs in Vietnam by tonnage than World War I, World War II, and the Korean War combined. It's a huge amount of firepower. Now, the problem is there are many when it comes to fighting the war in Vietnam. And one of the big problems is the nature of the fighting. The American military was undoubtedly the most advanced military on the planet in this period of time. But this was not a traditional war. This was a guerrilla war. And before you think we're going in with some, assassin machine gun wielding samurai guerrillas, that's not what we mean here. This was a guerrilla.
And they going gorillas, huh?
I don't even know what that means.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
It may not be provocative, but it is challenging for the U.S. military to get wins versus this type of fighting. It's mobile fighting. You're blending in with the civilians, the element of surprise. It becomes very difficult to find the Viet Cong, to find the enemy in South Vietnam. Guerrilla warfare is nothing new. We used it against the British during the American Revolution. Now here's the deal. Fighting in Vietnam is going to be plagued by problems, including finding the enemy, and you have this battle partly fought. Welcome to the jungle! The Viet Cong, the National Front for the Liberation, getting supplies from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the problem for the United States is going to be finding where the enemy is. Interrupting its supply of weapons from North Vietnam along this Ho Chi Minh Trail. And part of the problem is the Ho Chi Minh Trail is going through neutral Cambodia, so you can't stop that. It's crossing the border. And the U.S. and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, are having difficulty stopping this onslaught. So fighting in Vietnam is extremely difficult. In fact, this is one of the few photos of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in action. They're literally using bicycles to transport weapons across the border through Cambodia along these secret networks that we call the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so we underestimated the enemy. The enemy would be farmers by day and guerrilla fighters by night, and it becomes difficult. So the fighting's going on. One of the things that the U.S. largely does in this period is search and destroy missions. You go into a village, a town, you're looking for the Viet Cong, you're hoping to capture them, and in some cases they have success, but the difficulty is the moment you leave the Viet Congs back there. And this becomes very problematic because the civilians don't exactly like the Americans and the South Vietnamese military coming into their village, uprooting them. You don't really know who's telling the truth. In some cases, villages are burned to the ground. In fact, one U.S. official said we had to destroy the town in order to save it. And because the Viet Cong are throughout South Vietnam, it becomes difficult to fight the war. It becomes extremely difficult to fight the war. And not only just finding the enemy, they're underground in many cases. You know, one of the most remarkable things about this war is the ingenuity shown by the Viet Cong. Wherever you stand on this war, it is amazing. These secret networks of tunnels with these different underwater entrances, these entrances in the jungles, the medical hospitals and supplies and booby traps and all of this. In fact, when I was in Vietnam on a tour, you actually got to see the tunnels and how cramped and how tightly, fit, especially my 6'4" American self. And these booby traps and these mines and all of these different tools. This is a museum display in Vietnam showing the horrible nature of the fighting and the booby traps that American soldiers had to try to avoid. So all this stuff's going on, and the American people are being told by the government, by the generals, that they could see the light at the end of the tunnel, that the war was somehow going to be over soon. And in 1967-68, there's this feeling that the war's almost done, the light at the end of the tunnel, but in reality, for 3 years, we had been fighting this war. In fact, one of the big generals at the time, General Westmoreland, he keeps giving these reports that the war is going well, and the American people are believing it. Until, of course, reality sets in. And the big moment, another big moment you need to know for the Vietnam War is the Tet Offensive. And if you don't know, the Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, and in January of 1968, there was supposed to be a ceasefire during the celebrations. And during that ceasefire, the Viet Cong, with the help and the supplies of the North Vietnamese military, this attack will hit nearly every major South Vietnamese cities. The U.S. Embassy in Saigon was hit way down here. U.S. military bases are hit throughout the country. In fact, you can see on this map all the different locations the Viet Cong were able to strike. And the reality is, the Tet Offensive is a big shock. Now, militarily, we stopped the Viet Cong. They don't win after like a month-long fight. The Viet Cong are pushed back. There's a huge loss of life on the Viet Cong side, but militarily it's a defeat for the Viet Cong, but politically it's a victory because politically we look weak. In fact, it starts to show that no place is secure, that this war that we almost thought was over, we were being told was almost over, is nowhere near being over. Following the Tet Offensive, the most respected news commentator Walter Cronkite says that this war looks like it's headed for stalemate. And so the American people following Tet begin to turn against the Johnson administration. We start to really question the progress reports that we had been getting. In fact, one of the things that happens is this war is a war that is heavily featured on television.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
And the administration of Johnson starts to face a credibility gap. People are watching the body reports every night on their TV, and they're seeing images and horrible images of dead Americans and dead South Vietnamese and dead Viet Cong, and it looks like the truth isn't being told to the American people, and this credibility gap is a huge problem. The optimism of the administration is not being translated to the television set. The version of the administration and the reality are completely different. That credibility gap exists. In fact, people are seeing these horrible things like,
I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells like victory.
you know, the use of napalm. The use of napalm was used, and it was a gasoline-based bomb to set fire to huge areas of jungle or land to flesh out the Viet Cong. And inevitably, you're going to have innocent people hit in this type of situation. You get the use of Agent Orange, which was used to kill the jungle, the leaves and the plants. And it's chemical based, and Agent Orange being sprayed on the jungles to expose the Viet Cong and the tunnels and the trails and the secret hideouts. The problem is these things are going to have hugely negative consequences. We're going to know they're going to cause cancer and birth defects in both American soldiers and innocent Vietnamese people. And you get horrible, horrible massacres take place. My Lai Massacre in 1968 takes place where American soldiers go into a village and open fire and kill hundreds, anywhere between 300 to 500 civilians, children, men, and women. And you have a lot of just negative events occurring. And you really have the nation deeply divided between hawks and doves. Hawks are feeling that we should go further into Vietnam with our military power, that politicians are holding back, that we could win this war if we unleash the full power and potential of the American military. And doves are saying we should withdraw. In fact, America is divided. You have the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, organizing. You have anti-war protests all over the country on college campuses, especially the rise of the New Left, which are talking about changing American society, not just the Vietnam War, but also civil rights issues. You have a draft where people are running to Canada or trying to avoid it and burning their draft cards. You have these protests taking place. Now, throughout the war, the majority tended to support the war. They were the so-called silent majority. But you have this very vocal population that is protesting in the streets. In fact, in 1968, Johnson kind of shocks the country, including his party, when in March, late March, he decides he is not going to run for re-election. He actually had other members of his party saying that they were going to run. You had people like Eugene McCarthy and Robert F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, JFK's younger brother. They're running as anti-war Democrats. And Johnson says he's not going to run. And for Johnson, his presidency was dominated by the Vietnam War. He had this goal of the Great Society, his domestic reform program, and yet it's not going to be achieved, partly because of the just huge amount of attention and money that the Vietnam War is going to cost. People are literally chanting in the streets, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? So he decides to step aside, and the Democrats are completely divided. In fact, when they have their convention in the summer of 1968, there are riots taking place in Chicago at the Democratic convention. Humphrey, the VP under Johnson, gets the nomination, but the party is a mess. Kennedy is assassinated, depriving them of one of their young rising stars. And in 1968, the nation turns to Richard Nixon, who makes a remarkable political comeback, and he promises during the campaign, one of his promises is to end the war in Vietnam, peace with honor. And in the next lecture, we'll take a look at what Tricky Dick does. Thank you for watching. Click the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you already have it, and have a beautiful day.